And since it's 6:30, I'll go ahead. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deborah Lockwood, Chair of the Washington County Planning Commission. Today is October 19th, 2022, and this evening's meeting of the Planning Commission is now in order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Yes. Commissioner Havner,
Present.
Commissioner Milliman,
Present.
Commissioner Bidu,
Present.
Commissioner Petrillo,
Sorry, present.
Commissioner Podar. It's like she's absent. Commissioner Wellner,
Present.
Commissioner Will,
Present.
Vice Chair Dye,
Present.
Chair Lockwood,
Present.
Okay, it looks like we have 8 total present. We have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Aguilar. May we have the director's report, please?
Yes, you may. I'm Erin Wardell, Interim Planning and Development Services Manager, and I will be giving the director's report. As noted in an email sent to the Planning Commission members last week and reminded earlier this week, staff and PC leadership proposed a pause on resuming our hybrid or in-person meetings. The reason we proposed pausing that and the reason that we're virtual still tonight is because when we had the discussion at the last meeting, several PC members raised some very good points about challenges with participating in person. And so staff wanted the opportunity to have further discussions about that and talk about how we can maybe accommodate some of that, or just thinking a little bit more about how it could work. And so we think we need a little bit more time and a little bit more discussion on that. We're happy to have that when the Planning Commission would like to do that. We also learned that our primary IT liaison who runs these meetings for us was leaving the county. And so that leaves our IT department a little bit short-staffed, and that makes it challenging to run a hybrid meeting. Those are pretty intensive on staff time. And then a third point is that our county administrator's office has indicated some challenges with running some of the hybrid meetings. And so we kind of like them to be able to work out some of the challenges before we try to do it and make sure that somebody else has piloted it and resolved all of those challenges. So for those reasons, we're proposing a pause for right now. We would like to set a goal of having an in-person or a hybrid PC meeting in February of 2023. And that would be at the time when we have 2 new Planning Commission members. And so that would be a good opportunity for people to maybe have a chance to meet in person and start to meet those new members and meet each other, because I know many of you have not had the opportunity to meet each other or staff in person. So I think that's a goal that we'd like to set if the Planning Commission would like to do that with us. Regarding the upcoming vacancies on the Planning Commission, our formal recruitment for those 2 places ended yesterday. However, people can still apply. And so if you know people who may be interested, this would be for District 2 and for District 4. I would encourage you to encourage them to apply. They can find the information on the county's website or reach out to any staff. Todd is our Planning Commission liaison, and he can answer questions for people who would like to apply. Commissioner Petrella?
I was curious, if it's closed, then how can they apply?
It's not a real formal closing, right? They like to be able to say it's closed so that we can start looking at who's on the list. But if somebody else throws their hat in the ring and wants to be added to the list, we can accommodate that. I think that's kind of generally how it works.
Thanks.
But they do like to set deadlines for recruitments for boards and commissions, just so that people know that on this date, we're going to start looking at the list. But of course, we can still look at other candidates if they come in. So please do encourage people you know who might be good Planning Commission members to apply. We may have an upcoming event in April for Fair Housing Month. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon is available to provide a training, and that is something the Planning Commission members had expressed some interest in. They would like to be able to possibly combine that with Hillsborough and Beaverton's planning commissions because they may also be interested in that training. And so that's something we would like to confirm availability for. It would be for either our April 5th day meeting or our April 19th evening meeting. So we'll be working on putting that together once we confirm availability with the other two planning commissions. We have received feedback from planning commissioners on challenges navigating the county's new website. Please know that staff shared those challenges and we are all learning to navigate it together. It's been an experience moving to a new website. I think that it is going to be really great going into the future. There are some really good things about it, but we're still working out the problems. So if you are finding something wrong on the website, please reach out, let us know, and we'll get it on the list to be fixed. And there's, of course, always room for continuous improvement, even if something's not broken. If it's just not working very well, we can think about ways to make that work better for you. The whole point of the website is to make it better for the community, and so we'd like to work towards that together. And then I have a brief update on our work on significant natural resources. We are in the process of hiring a consultant. We released a request for proposals. So that is on the street right now. One of the first tasks in that work is going to be developing our public involvement and engagement plan. And so at that time, we will start thinking about how the Planning Commission can be involved and help support that work and at what stage the Planning Commission would be involved. We intend to come back to the Planning Commission in December or January once our consultants are on board and we have an update on that. I want to give an update on the board this week. Yesterday, the board held a work session on the status of our 21-22 long-range planning work program, and they gave staff directions to add a consent item for the November 29th board meeting to modify the current work program to add several mandated tasks. These are tasks that are mandated by either state or local rules, and so we don't really have a lot of choice. It's something that we just need to add to our work program. We will then begin the process in early 2023 for a 2-year work program that would cover fiscal years 23-24 and 24-25. So continuing our existing work program, adding a few mandated tasks will be what the board does in November, and then we'll come back with the full development process of a 2-year work program starting early next year. The other action at the board hearing yesterday was a vote to reject ordinance number 883, which was the extension of Cornelius Pass Road. And so that ordinance is now wrapped up. So for today's Planning Commission meeting, you will have your first hearing on ordinance number 889, minor amendments to the Community Development Code. For our upcoming Planning Commission meetings, November 2nd will be our day meeting. You will have your first hearing on ordinance 890, which is middle housing land division amendments to the Community Development Code, and that implements Senate Bill 458. If needed, we'll have a second hearing on the ordinance you're hearing tonight, number 889, which is minor amendments to the CDC. We have a couple of ideas for work session items. For example, the county is just now launching our countywide transit study, and so we thought that might be something the PC might be interested in a work session about at some point, and that may fit into that meeting. And then for your November 16th evening meeting, if needed, we can have a second hearing on ordinance 890, the middle housing land division amendments, and to be determined if there will be other items for that meeting. That was a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions? Commissioner Petrillo?
Could you briefly, no gory details, but fill us in on the Cornelius Pass extension ordinance? Did you say it was rejected? Is that what I heard?
Yes, the board rejected the ordinance.
So it effectively died. I mean, it wasn't passed, and so it just goes back into the planning bin. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to describe it. but I wouldn't expect that it would resurface at any time in the near future, right? So it's something that we've evaluated. We have some technical analysis of it, but the board expressed that they, at this time, do not want to take action on that amendment to the transportation system plan.
And that was decided at the last meeting?
Yesterday, yes.
Yesterday, okay. I mean, I kind of want to hear it, so I'll listen in. And then the status of the tile flat extension, where does that stand?
Ordinance 882 is the tile flat road extension. The board continued that hearing until January. I forget the exact date in January. I think it's January 24th. It's the last Tuesday meeting, I think, in January. The board continued it to January because the city of Tigard has asked to have most of the area covered by that road, most of, not all, but most of, brought into the urban growth boundary. And Metro is expected to make the UGB decision sometime early next year. And so in continuing the hearing, the board wanted to find out the outcome of Metro's decision on the UGB before they made their decision on the road.
Thank you. Was that hearing yesterday as well?
No, that was in August. So we had 2 engrossment hearings for the tile flat extension. They were held on July 26th and August 2nd. And at the August 2nd hearing, the board continued to January because we did not yet know the direction from Metro. Metro's chief operating officer came out with her recommendation last week for the UGB expansion it's a land swap, not an expansion. They're looking to bring land, swap land in Clackamas County to add land in Washington County to the UGB. She did recommend for it. So you can look at her information online if you're interested. Metro Council will be having a work session about it tomorrow at their hearing. And so her recommendation is online, but they've identified 3 different scenarios, meaning 3 different pieces of land in Clackamas County that could be turned back into urban reserve so that the UGB can be expanded for City of Tigard.
Yeah, those were the tile, those road extensions, including the 185th, were 3 major discussions we had last year in prior 12 months. And so if I'm correct, they were 0 for 3 at the county commission level.
Those 3 were, there actually was another road extension that we didn't discuss very much that was a part of 881 that did go forward. So there was another new road that was added to the TSP. It was down in the Sherwood Tonkin employment area, a collector level facility.
I'm going to just mention, as you enter into what I've heard will be potentially a TSP update, is assuming that those 3 are maybe not the last one, but the 185th and Cornelius Pass are in the, I'm not going to call it the dustbin, but in the planning bin. That would be an ideal time, I would think, to bring them back on the table for deliberation and consideration.
As a part of doing the major TSP update, it's probably something that we'll consider. There will be a lot of discussions and policy analysis that go on as a part of that. Thank you. Commissioner Wellner?
One question, one comment on the new fantastic website. The question is how long do I have before I have to update it, the 1,000 different contacts I have with the county in my Outlook to WashingtonCountyOR.gov?
We have not been given a date at which our email addresses stop working. So unless Teresa or somebody else has heard a specific date, as far as I know, they will work for a long time. So, which is good because when I signed into Zoom right now, I didn't remember my new one, so I used my old one.
Okay. Can you make it at least until I retire?
I'll see what I can do.
So then the other thing is that the old website was cumbersome, but it had that basically key links bar on the left side, and 2 components of that. One was the access to the GIS service, and one was access to the community development code, I think. maybe I'm the only one who uses those links, but I expect at least most people in my industry use them. There's some key, I'm looking at the page right now, and kind of towards the top, there's some key links, code enforcement, crime, domestic violence, that kind of stuff. I don't know if that would be an appropriate place to add those kind of links. At some point in time, I'm going to find it and just create a bookmark, but it was always convenient to have them there on that first page.
We're hearing some feedback like that, that there's things people were frequently going to that they can't find. And so we're making notes of what we're hearing and we'll pass that on to the web team.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Wardell or comments? Okay, I don't see none. Thank you very much for your report. The next item is public. If people in the public want to talk to us, and so I'm going to ask Ms. Aguilar, has anyone signed up in advance to speak to us tonight?
Chair Lockwood, nobody has signed up, but would anyone in attendance like to communicate to the Planning Commission on non-agenda items? If so, please indicate by raising your virtual hand. Seeing nobody, we can move on.
Okay, thank you. Our next item is our public hearing on Ordinance 889. So may we go ahead with the staff presentation, please?
First, and Karina Rendies will be giving that presentation.
Good evening. Thank you, Teresa. Hello, Planning Commissioners. I'm Karina Rendies, Associate Planner from Community Planning, here to present the staff report for your hearing on Ordinance 889, which provides minor amendments to the county's comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. My presentation will start with the context and an overview of the ordinance, then summarize the ordinance as filed, followed by some proposed changes, and we'll conclude with the staff recommendation for your commission's action this evening. Next slide.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think Commissioner Milliman might be stuck in the attendees section.
And just a point of order that Commissioner Podar has joined.
Okay. I believe we have all of the commissioners with us now. I will go forward. So thank you. So the context for the minor amendments. All right. Apologies for my delay, trying to go back to my screen mode here. The ordinance does make minor corrections and updates to various volumes of the comprehensive plan, which I'll just be calling the plan going forward, as well as limited changes to make housekeeping corrections and changes that are very minor, but propose to revise some existing processes to reduce barriers to urban residential development. This ordinance does propose to respond to community and developer requests and issues identified by county staff. Internal stakeholders included plan review staff from the Planning and Development Services Division that planning is embedded in, as well as our engineering and traffic and survey division. We also considered input from Clean Water Services staff and the county surveyor. Next slide, please. So Ordinance 889 will amend 3 volumes of the county's plan, the Comprehensive Framework Plan for the urban area, which I may sometimes call the CFP, the Bethany Community Plan, and the Community Development Code, or CDC, I may also use the term just code. And if I say that, I do really mean the community development code. So public notice was provided after the ordinance was filed in accordance with county and state regulations. That includes announcements in the Oregonian, notice to subscribers via email or actual mailed notice in some cases, as well as updates to the county's land use ordinance webpage. And we did receive public comment on this notice, which I will cover in a moment. Next slide. So to start with, just to summarize the things that are in the ordinance, the first changes amend the comprehensive framework plans policy 41 regarding urban growth boundary expansions. And it does two things. First, delay county implementation of metro urban growth expansions until any appeals are resolved. County implementation includes plan amendments to recognize the expansion areas, which were once rural, are now urban, and apply one of two future development districts, the FD20 district, which ensures compliance with Metro's requirements. So this change is a slight policy shift to delay county's implementation until all appeals are resolved, and it aligns with the Department of Land Conservation and Development's request in the most recent Metro UGB expansion process, which did take 3 years to resolve. The other change to the CFP is a removal of incorrect information about land located in the East Hillsborough Community Plan area. The second document in the plan that ordinance amends is the Bethany Community Plan, which has 2 chapters, one for most of the Bethany community area, and then a second one which is focused specifically on North Bethany. To eliminate unnecessary duplication, the ordinance will show North Bethany information only on the maps contained in that second chapter, which is the focus of the area. Next slide. So the ordinance does, I apologize. So continuing with our summary here, moving on to what the Community Development Code does. Those changes include corrections to various grammatical, numbering, and cross-reference areas in various sections. We also update the Committee for Community Involvement, or CCI, membership language, as well as the provisions for the FD20 district for consistency with the change I just mentioned on the previous slide. The other thing that this ordinance updates in the CDC shown on this slide is a revision to our existing standards for a use allowance for vehicle camping for homeless persons. Now, this is a change to ensure that we are requiring storage for personal belongings, which is consistent with the program requirements adopted by the City of Beaverton. Next slide. So ordinance 889 does clarify a lot of things in the code. So we have them listed here. This includes standards for side yard maintenance easements in urban residential districts. This includes the dwelling allowance in state law referencing wildlife habitat, and making sure people understand that pertains to special tax assessment. We also are clarifying that clean fill sites, what they are is based on the Department of Environmental Quality regulations about clean fill. The ordinance also helps clarify how to calculate residential off-street parking and future right-of-way. And then we have a clarification in the ordinance that school service provider letters are needed for all dwellings outside the UG. Next slide, please. So there are a number of changes intended to facilitate residential urban development now and into the future, which I'll talk about on this slide and the next one. Currently, the code is silent about a height limit for accessory structures in transit-oriented districts. Current planning did request a change to add a height limit, and we're going to add the height limit that's 15 feet. That's consistent with non-transit oriented districts. Staff also noted that this change would ensure we're not permitting lots of oversized garages and other accessory uses that really aren't very transit oriented. So the ordinance also revises urban private street provisions to allow curbs and easements that would otherwise be located in a tract. This is a developer request to facilitate certain infill residential development. And we believe that this approach will likely streamline the monumenting process. So that's where the property lines are surveyed and they're documented with a monument or survey pen. But we do think that there may be some trade-offs with doing that, including additional filing and recording costs. This is a policy change in our code to treat private street curbs like sidewalks. Next slide. Finally, this ordinance proposes to revise existing procedures, and we'll start with changes to the variance and hardship relief section. So the ordinance adds a new type 1 process for minor adjustments to setbacks. Issues requiring those kinds of adjustments, 12 inches or less to setbacks, most frequently happen during the construction period. And the time and cost involved trying to address them using the current options, which would be a type 2 or type 3 land use review, don't really match the scale of the issue. The other things to keep in mind about this change is that other adjustments and variances require findings of hardship based on discretionary criteria. What's being proposed here, a type 1 action, is a ministerial action which cannot use those kinds of discretionary criteria. So this does result in a change in policy, as no hardship would be required to qualify for the proposed type 1 setback adjustment. Additional changes will rename both the section title and the hardship relief procedure. The procedure would now be known as the type 2 adjustment, and the section itself will be called variances and adjustments, since all of the remedies in this section provide relief from hardship. Adjustments is also a more familiar term to most code users. Finally, the ordinance also rearranges how the content in this section is organized for greater consistency with other code sections. Next slide, please. So finally, the ordinance would revise existing procedures in the code for land divisions and property line adjustments. Changes will allow a property line adjustment on land with preliminary approval for a land division. There will still be a prohibition against making these kinds of changes if you have a land division with final approval. This will provide an opportunity to address boundary issues that typically come up between preliminary and final approval of land divisions. And it will also remove a barrier to changes in property ownership. And that was a benefit that was identified by a local developer. In order to implement the change, the ordinance also modifies the minor review provisions relating to phase development and adds a new criterion to ensure the provision of public facilities align with any phasing involved. Next slide. So once an ordinance is filed, it may be changed through engrossment. Engrossment is directed by the board. However, the basis for the engrossment may be a staff recommendation. It may be a recommendation from your commission, or we may sometimes receive new information or public input that results in a change in board priorities or policies. So based on further review, we do have some proposed changes we'd like your commission to consider. So based on input from the county surveyor, we are recommending some changes to refine the language related to property adjustments and land divisions. These changes include removing the reference to lots or parcels subject to property line adjustments and the language related to sales. This will ensure we're more consistent with state law. We want to add cross-references to clarify standards that apply to lot and parcels involved in both the land division and a property line adjustment. And we've shown our proposed language for that in the staff report on pages 6 and 8. Sorry, pages 7 and 8. Next slide, please. Staff is also recommending refinements to revisions relating to the membership of the Committee for Community Involvement, or CCI, to include chairs of the CCI. And are showing that language here on the screen now, but essentially we've added that third subset of chairpersons of authorized CCI committees here. And this was a change that was reflected by CCI represented to better reflect their bylaws. Next slide. So staff's recommendation is that you conduct the public hearing and then go on to recommend approval of ordinance number 889 to the Board of Commissioners with engrossment. And that engrossment would include changes proposed on pages 7 and 8 of the staff report, as well as the previous slide in this presentation. That concludes my presentation. I remain available for any questions commissioners may have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have questions? Commissioner Milliman.
I had a question about the curbs and the easement and what the current process is and how that would relate specifically to utilities where people would be putting underground electricity or plumbing. Does that have any interaction?
That's a good question. Utilities currently are placed in public utility easements, and those may be located on property that's part of somebody's lot or parcel. They may be in a roadway track. Most commonly, they're going to overlap both those things. And this is kind of like a bit of a cake layer situation in that you can have a private street track with an easement for access as well as an easement for public utilities on it. And so they just get layered on top of one another. So changes to where the curbs are located will not affect the location of utilities.
But there could be a curb or a sidewalk that would need to be repaired when someone installs or deals with the utilities, right? So if it's in the public utility easement and somebody's built it there, utility would have to repair it when they had to go through it.
So it depends on what the public utility easement requirements are. I would say that is not my area of specialty as far as like what the legal responsibilities are. What I can tell you is that I have seen numerous plats with public utility easements in various locations, public streets, private streets, as well as private property.
That makes sense. I guess I'm just thinking about the complexity of sidewalks and swales and what we get into as far as replacing things or installing electricity. But I mean, you answered my question. There is a potential where there would be a sidewalk over utility or would need to be addressed as part of utility plan.
So when it comes to things like swales, that's going to be a storm management, and it will be we do have clean water service plan reviewers who are going to take a look at both public streets and private streets. And if they have any kind of stormwater management elements in them. So those elements get reviewed by those specialists.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Wellner.
I have a question, but I'm going to start by responding in part to what Commissioner Milliman was asking about, is that the PUE that Corrine was speaking to sits behind the sidewalk. And what this change does is it allows you to pin a property corner in the curb, which would be in front of the sidewalk. So that they'd be the electric, the cable, the fiber, all that stuff sets quite a ways away from where this pin would be located. What this change does is it allows you to do a pre-monumentation of a plat, which is for a lot of developers a lot more streamlined of a process. The reason you can't oftentimes do a pre-mon is because the pin is located in the sidewalk, and you can't actually put the pin in the ground until the sidewalk gets poured, but the sidewalk doesn't get poured until the house gets built. And so there's all sorts of bonding that needs to get done and inspections that need to happen after the fact that this change helps to resolve. It just adds some flexibility, and it really doesn't create any problems. And utilities are almost never located under a curb line unless they're running perpendicular to it, like a lateral. But as far as like storm and sewer and water, you can't put it under the curb line because they don't want to have to tear out the curb if something needs to get repaired. So that's a response to that piece. My biggest concern, and Corrine, I apologize for not circling back with you on this. I just read it today, but under 304 7.1, the change to how the easement between the units has been proposed. I'm hopeful that this is not staff's intent. But the way I'm reading this and the way it is drafted, it basically says that if you reduce that setback from 5 feet down to 3 feet, which is done all the time, then you can't put a fence between those two units. And so basically nobody would have a fenced backyard. Is that what staff's trying to accomplish?
So we were requested to specifically call that out to remind everybody that a fence is an obstruction, and that the required maintenance easement has never allowed obstructions, and that includes fences.
But do you realize that the intent of the maintenance easement was to create an open area between the buildings, so that when you're painting the side of your building or of your house, or you're pressure washing, then you can put the foot of a ladder down and lean it up against your house, and that space between the units was protected by an easement. It was never intended to remove the side yard fence in the rear yard.
So the wording that, again, there's always been a prohibition against obstructions in that easement. And what we heard from staff who works with that is typically people go ahead and do put up fences. And so if the language could be revised to clarify that the obstructions cannot include easements. So that was intentional.
Well, the way the original language was stated, it was stated that the space between the structures needed to be kept clear, not the space behind the structures. So basically, anybody that goes to a 3-foot side yard setback can no longer enclose their backyard with a fence, is what this language says, which I would be strongly opposed to. And I think the whole home building industry would be strongly opposed to it.
Yeah. So I think, Corrine, maybe we should look at this. I do see what the commissioner is saying about the change. I think we were thinking about it in terms of between the buildings versus in the backyard. Or are you thinking that we are wanting it also to be in the backyard? I'm not sure where the private maintenance easement extends to, if it extends all the way or just between the two buildings.
So I think and I apologize because I keep trying to pull up the content, but then we keep talking and I keep coming back and to say it is possible that there is an inadvertent consequence, and I agree with Teresa that we would want to look at that to see if what you're asserting is accurate, and bring that to our partners in current planning as well to get their take on it.
Okay, the prior language was pretty clear. I mean, because it did state between the buildings, and this new language strikes between the buildings. And so the way you see this more dense product built is rather than having a fence at the front of your house, it gets put at the back of the house. And so the area up to the back corner of the house remains open for access. So you can paint, you can pressure wash, you can do that kind of stuff. But we can't do something that would remove a side yard fence at the rear of a house. So that'd be a mistake.
Yeah, I see. I understand the concern there for sure. Yeah.
Let me see here. If you want to go to Commissioner Will, go ahead, because I did have at least one more clarification and I got to find it.
Okay, Commissioner Will.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to initially ask which exact line item it is, and I found it, but I don't know if anybody else wants to read it, or if you guys want to state it out loud. But I guess my question is, I appreciate that fences are the kind of things in this space that most often get built. But is it necessary for the code to outline everything or specific things in this case that might get put in the way of an easement? I just feel that that's up to the beneficiaries of the easement to object. Hey, you just put a beanbag toss board in the way and I can't get in there, or you just planted a rhododendron and I can't get in there. I don't know why we're calling out fences in code when it's if it's a private maintenance easement, it's an easement. And then if the person who benefits from it can't access it, then they work with the other property owner to say, hey, please remove this easement, or I'll remove it. And so I don't know, it just seems odd that we're getting into defining, like a mismanagement is a public utility easement. It happens all the time. There's a 10-foot public utility easement, as Commissioner Wellner was mentioning, usually behind the sidewalk across the front yard. And you don't want to obstruct that, but people go ahead and they do it. And then later, when somebody wants to come in there and there's obstructions, then they need to be removed. It's at the time when they become a hassle that they get removed, but the code doesn't go in and start listing all the things that may get built in a storm swale that might obstruct the storm swale. They just say don't obstruct it, period. And then so I think it's funny that we're listing. I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Mr. Wellner.
My second question, and I've got one more after that, is under section 375 about the height restriction for residential accessory uses to 15 feet. Does that also apply to ADUs?
So accessory uses are a separate use in our code from accessory dwelling units. So this would be specific to an accessory use, not specific to an accessory dwelling unit.
That could be confusing.
It is true that people have confused accessory uses and accessory dwelling units before. But they are two separate uses in our code.
So the only, I mean, I guess to remedy that, you could make a note that simply said, not ADUs pursuant to section blah, blah, blah. Just so it's clear that 15 feet doesn't apply to ADUs. I think that, I mean, ultimately you could figure it out, but my initial read was, does that affect ADUs? And then the next one is under 413-4, the off-street parking standards. And this is maybe more than what can be managed in a minor amendments ordinance, but we just adopted middle housing standards that limited the max driveway width per unit to 8 feet, I believe. And ultimately, so basically we've adopted something that says a driveway space can be considered adequate if it's so long as it's 8 feet wide. But now we're adopting this standard that says it must be 10 feet wide for everything that's not middle housing. It might be helpful to add some consistency to just mirror the 8-foot requirement as a minimum for a single space. But again, I see that could reach beyond this minor amendment. I just think it's the inconsistency is unnecessary.
And just a note on parking, with the climate friendly and equitable communities rules that were adopted, we're gonna be looking closely at our parking section. There's a lot of focus in that on parking. So really here, we were just looking to make a small tweak to clarify. We weren't looking to change our kind of parking standards, but that is something that we could look at when we look further at our parking regulations as part of the CFAC work.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a minimum, we have a minimum driveway width of 10 feet and a maximum driveway width of 8 feet in 2 different parts of the code, which is odd. And that is all that I have. Thank you.
So I think, yes, Commissioner Will.
I just wanted to say I also felt it odd about the height limit of this accessory uses or versus structures versus 80 accessory dwelling units. And what I've actually felt odd about it was I heard in the justification for it was to make sure that we don't promote parking or big garages or something. And I thought that's funny that like a structure that might be too high, it's not like they're going to put 4 cars on top of each other inside of their garage by building a really high accessory structure. So maybe I misunderstood what was stated, but like if the reason for having a height limit is to prevent the building from getting too big, then you should be limiting its width and depth, not its height. So that's, and then my previous comments about the obstructions between the buildings, I just wanted to concur with what Commissioner Wellner was saying, that it should be clarified that it's only between the buildings where the area shall not be obstructed. So I wanted to concur with that. And of course, I don't think you need to list which type of obstructions are not allowed because it's obstruction, period. But I think I made that point before, but I wanted to concur. Thanks.
Commissioner Milliman.
I was curious about the section for the changes could be made to properties between preliminary and final approval. And I was just curious if you could give some examples of what types of changes those are and then how that would be approved and documented. I assume we do preliminary approval and then final approval for a reason.
So we're proposing to allow people to be able to do a property line adjustment between preliminary approval and final approval. This would be something that would be a concurrent review with minor revisions. So I'm wondering, are you asking what things are allowed to be modified under the minor revisions provision currently?
Yeah, and really what problem we're solving with it.
So those are really, I think, maybe two separate questions. So the problem that we're trying to solve, there's really two problems, depending on what your perspective is. So one problem is from our surveyor or county surveyor's point of view, as well as property owners who find out that there's a gap in the property boundary descriptions or an overlap in those descriptions. And the remedy for that is to do a property line adjustment. But if you are in the middle of getting your final approval for a land division, you're precluded right now from being able to utilize that existing remedy. So by allowing folks who are in this situation to be able to do a property line adjustment, they can address those boundary changes. So that's the problem we're really trying to solve, but there is an added benefit to that, in that by allowing there to be a property line adjustment in that kind of period of time in which you've gotten your preliminary land use approval to subdivide your land, and now you're working on all of your conditions to be able to obtain your final approval. So these conditions include various things like recording easements and getting your utilities planned and installed, as well as your ensuring that like you've done your THRP items where you're reserving and preserving recreational space or open space. There are oftentimes a lot of things that you need to do, and that can take some time in which to do them. If at any point in time you would like to do any kind of change in property ownership, the only things that you can sell during that time are going to be any existing underlying parcels. And in some cases, you might want to adjust where those boundaries are in order to provide somebody with a parcel that will match the outlines of the lots that you've proposed in your preliminary subdivision. And I am hoping this isn't too complex, but what's happening here is there's an opportunity to parcel out the land to have the development and the building be conducted by different parties. But you can only do that if you can adjust the boundaries in a way that makes sense for the next stage of development. And we don't want people to be stuck. So this provides an opportunity for people to adjust those lines, be able to sell portions of the property, and then move forward with the development. But we've also said, hey, if you're going to do that, we want to make sure that you're providing public services to align with the different parcels you're selling, and making sure that the phasing is aligning with that. And that is something else that the minor revision review will do. So that folks will be able to apply for both a minor revision to say, hey, I'm changing things a little bit, here's how, and then here's my property line adjustment that goes along with it that shows you which property boundaries are being adjusted. And I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions or clarifications you have on that.
Sounds like you're just changing venues or process for what people are already doing. Is that kind of a summary? Like you just ask the minor changes folks instead of the major review folks?
So for folks who, I mean, what we've done in the past is we've basically said, okay, go ahead and do this through minor revision, even though minor revision doesn't say you can do that. So we've added some criteria to say, yes, you can do that. But if you do that, you also need to do these other things.
Okay.
Commissioner Wellner.
To respond to Commissioner Milliman, this request kind of came from me. I also came from the county surveyor too, but what Kareem just described, the scenario where you're trying to change something after something's already approved is a circumstance that I've dealt with. And it's a circumstance that you've been able to deal with in the county's code, but the county's code was generally inconsistent with your ability to do it. My circumstance was I had a 94 lot subdivision on 2 tax lots. And the market at the time was relatively soft. It was much harder to sell 94 lots than it was to sell a 43 lot subdivision and a 51 lot subdivision. So I wanted to take my 2 parcels and orient them in a way that I could sell them in 2 separate phases, basically. And the code today says that if you have a land use approval in place, then you can't process a subsequent property line adjustment. This allows you to do that. This allows you to do something that we were already doing, but it's just a clarification in the code now. And it was never utilized. I mean, I guess at one point in time, the PLA process was utilized in a nefarious way that can't be used anymore. That's not what this change is for. This change is to kind of simplify something that people already do.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Will.
Yeah, I want to say that I think this is a good change for clarification purposes, and also because it's very much needed. Someone might ask, well, why don't they just do the property line adjustment up front and then apply for their development and put that property line at the phase line in the first place? And that way, when they go in for their land division, it's already in the right spot. But you don't know through the land division process that phase may get adjusted. So you get your approval, and you did your property line adjustment first, but the phase changed, and so your line's in the wrong spot. So it really helps facilitate that. Also, for example, if somebody owns two or three parcels and they want to retain their residents on the site, so this allows the approval of their land for division, and then allows a property line adjustment to shrink down their large lot to the small lot that they're going to retain, and allow for a phased development of the rest of it. So I think it's a great idea. I'm all for it. Thanks.
Any further questions for Ms. Arendes? I'm not seeing any, so thank you very much. And now I will open the public hearing, and I need to ask the clerk if anyone is signed up to speak to us tonight about this ordinance.
Chair Lockwood, no one has signed up in advance. Would anyone in attendance like to provide testimony on the agenda item? If so, please indicate by raising your virtual hand. Seeing nobody, we can move on.
Thank you, Ms. Aguilar. Now we can have further discussion of the ordinance. In particular, I'm wondering if we, based on the changes that were discussed, if we're not really ready to consider recommending this ordinance, was there further engrossment that was going to be considered, Ms. Cherniak?
There was the one question that Commissioner Wellner had about the intent of the private maintenance easement, and whether what we did was changing that in intent there. So that is something that we probably can't do on the fly. We would want to look at it and probably just talk that over with current planning. The Planning Commission could make a recommendation that be changed to clarify that, or we could come back to answer that question.
Okay.
If that's the only item, we'd be happy to
Okay.
come back, but it could be something that just as part of the motion, you would make the recommendation and then we could move that forward.
Okay. Commissioner Wellner.
I wouldn't mind seeing that final change. I mean, I think that this is something we can get done pretty quick in a meeting with probably some other stuff going on.
Okay, at this time, are there other issues or topics that people want to bring up about this ordinance? Commissioner Will. Commissioner Will.
I think I got the mute off. Yes, if I could just ask the staff to maybe address my concern where they were saying that the words including fences was added. Is that specifically as they think fences are getting in the way of people putting up ladders or doing work or moving between the buildings? Because what happens if the fence was 2 feet high or 3 feet high? And also clarify whether a fence permit is required, and is this going to be used as a tool to deny fence permit applications between buildings, or can people just build a fence in there, you know, and then if their neighbor doesn't notice that they're building a future obstruction, then it just gets built? Does anybody know?
So we can bring more information back on some of the questions you have about, I mean, one of the things is that a fence is considered a structure, and it already says that you must keep the easement clear of structures. So I think what we're trying to do here is just clarify for people who are reading it, who may not be thinking that a fence is a structure, that yes, indeed, a fence is a structure. So it's maybe just kind of putting people on notice that that's what this means. But we could provide a little bit more information in written form if that would help.
Yeah, I just think that there's not a lot of space in your property if it's a 3-foot side yard on your side of the property line and a 3-foot side yard on your neighbor's property line. But I know in these areas there are often air conditioning units that are installed. People put their garbage cans. People put bicycles. So some of that stuff is temporary. Some of it's permanent. But if you know, structures that will obstruct, right? So if you can build a structure that does not obstruct your neighbor from putting up a ladder, if the goal is to make sure your neighbor can put up a ladder, I don't think we need to specify which types of structures. Just say any structure that will obstruct access. And then if you put up a structure that doesn't obstruct access, then it's okay.
So this section does go on to say, and it's on the next page, but heat pumps and air conditioners are allowed. So you have to read the language pretty closely to see, but apparently there are a lot of problems with these easements and with people blocking them. And so this is in there, I think, for that reason. And again, I think probably current planning gets a lot of questions or concerns raised about it and had asked us to provide this clarification in there about the fences. But we can provide a little bit more information about how our code defines structures and talk a little bit more about it and how this change might have inadvertently changed something else. So we can bring all of that together in a little short staff report for next time.
And
Commissioner
let me
Milliman.
just remind you,
sorry.
if the fence permit is required, that was another thing on that list. Is it or not?
It depends on the height of the fence, whether a permit is required. And we actually, our code matches building code on that. So if it's above, I believe it's 7 feet or taller, permit is required. And then smaller fences that involve retaining elements might also require a permit.
No more, Commissioner Will? Okay. Commissioner Milliman.
Maybe this is off topic, in which case we could skip it. But I'm curious how we decide what's going to go in an ordinance? Like this one seems to have everything from minor changes to some impactful things. Is it just, it's been a while and this is everything that's been proposed and we do this occasionally? Is there things that were not included in this that were suggested?
So that's a really good question, Commissioner Milliman. Typically, we would do 2 separate ordinances. We would have a housekeeping ordinance that are really all the very small changes that are slight corrections, things that are mistakes, scrivener's errors, that sort of thing. And then we would have a separate minor amendments ordinance. This time, since we have shortages with staff, and we decided to kind of group some of those together. So there's more in this than might normally be in a minor amendments ordinance. With minor amendments, a lot of times it's code fixes that our current planning staff has asked for, that they've identified over time through using the code and through working with community members and builders. And so we get a very long list from them each year. Then we do hear from builders, we hear from other people. And some years it's 5 items, some years it's 15 items. But we try to do something like this each year, just to keep on top of some of these more minor things that don't need their whole ordinance. And again, they're things identified by the public, by staff, or by developers that we end up kind of sorting through and determining which are maybe the most critical, and then moving forward with them.
Okay, thanks. I hope more people for you soon.
No, thank you.
Any other discussion? My sense is that we're not quite ready to proceed on this. Do other commissioners have a thought about that? Commissioner Wellner.
I'd like to see it come back, but I think, again, I think we can get it done pretty quickly when it does. That's a big enough, that the issue with the fence in my mind is a really big issue. And I'd just like to see the final product.
Commissioner Will.
Thank you, Chair. I was just thinking in a combination almost of some of the things we're talking about. I think I understood Commissioner Wellner's big concern is that it's not written in a way that you can't build a fence around your backyard. What if your backyard has an accessory structure and your neighbor has an accessory structure? I'm curious if staff know, are there any situations where accessory structures are allowed to be like 3 feet from a side property line? So then you would not be able to fence your rectangle backyard. You'd have if your tough shed was in the corner of your yard, your neighbor's tough shed, all of a sudden you can't put a fence between your tough sheds. So I think there's a concern about the fence related to accessory structures, as well as, putting a fence between main buildings. It gets complicated.
Commissioner Petrillo. You're muted, I think.
Yes, I am. Just a point of order, I would say, if that's the will of my colleagues, someone needs to make a motion to move to postpone this matter into this ordinance until such date. And it needs to be voted on.
Yeah, thank you.
And we could bring this back at the next meeting. We do have a meeting scheduled and a hearing on another matter for November 2nd. So we could bring it back on that date.
Commissioner Wellner.
I move to continue our discussion on ordinance 889 to November 2nd.
It's been moved to continue our discussion of this ordinance till November 2nd. Is there a second to that motion?
Petrillo seconds it.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Mr. Bovet, do we proceed with a voice roll call or?
I think a voice roll call, a voice vote will be fine here. You're just continuing here.
Well,
So indicate by hands up.
It is debatable, so you should ask if there's discussion.
Yes.
Thank you. Discussion of this motion? Commissioner Will.
I don't want to assume the obvious, but on November 2nd, the staff will come back with answers to the issues. We're not just going to postpone it and keep talking about it. We're going to postpone it with additional report from the staff.
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments? Or discussion? All right, let's proceed then with our, please indicate, I'll repeat, the motion is to continue this ordinance to our next meeting, November 2nd, and indicate by hands up, all in favor. So I'm seeing, okay, any opposed? Okay. Commissioner Petillo. Okay. That the motion carries by a unanimous vote, I believe. And we are ready, I think, to move on to our next item, which is Planning Commission announcements. The terminology was changed from, we used to say Planning Commission communications, but we've changed the terminology to be in line with what the Board of Commissioners uses. So does anyone have something they would like to share with their fellow commissioners tonight? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. And that means we are ready to consider the next item, which is adjournment. Are there any objections to adjourning? See none. We are adjourned. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.